So I'll get everyone to this Cardamom Seminar. And so we're very happy to have Dr. Martina Maher here from the University of the Highland Islands. And Adrian, I'll let you do the introductions.
Sure. Dr. Martina Maher is a Celtic studies researcher and lecturer, including research and teaching on all periods of the Gaelic languages, from early Gaelic or Old Irish to modern Irish and Scottish Gaelic as well. Her main research interests lie in medieval and early modern Gaelic literature, or I should probably be saying Gaelic literature, particularly that of the Finn cycle, in textual criticism and in the use of digital methods to capture, present, and analyze medieval manuscript texts. Today, Martina is going to be talking with us about her work on Faclair na Gaelic. So with that, I'll hand the floor over to you, Martina.
Nice. Thanks, Adrian. So as the title suggests, I am going to be talking about using manuscript material for this Dictionary of Scottish Gaelic, Faclair na Gaelic. And one of the things that enables the current dictionary to be compiled wholly digitally is that it is using the Digital Archive of Scottish Gaelic, DASC for short. And in doing so, it has a huge corpus of digital material of texts that are actually available and modern. However, incorporating the manuscript material is not quite so easy to do. So that required a particular part of the project and a lot of work to kind of think about how to incorporate that following on from the manuscripts themselves. So I've broken the talk down into 5 different parts. There's a wee introduction to the Faclair itself, a bit about, I will showcase some digital editions and give you a bit of a demo. We'll then take you behind the scenes so you can see the markup of these texts and the information that we're inputting to get that output on the web tool, look at querying the corpus, and then some visualizations as well. And these are things that can tell us different elements about that corpus that we have created. So to introduce you to the Faclair and the corpus itself, Faclair na Gaelic is going to be the first ever dictionary of Scottish Gaelic produced on historical principles, and that means that it aims to set out the development of each word of the language in terms of orthography, morphology, and semantics based on critical use of primary evidence. So the earliest primary evidence for Scottish Gaelic, or for Gaelic in Scotland, is to be found in pre-modern manuscript texts. Some of the items that are relevant to our purposes in looking at this history, they have been edited. Some of these texts, however, a lot of them, in fact, have not been edited. And even where editions exist, they might be problematic because they might be normalized to one extent or the other, might be using different editorial principles, etc., etc. So they're not uniform to be incorporated into the corpus quite easily. And then this is important for historical lexicography because that requires primary evidence to be as close as possible to the state in which it is physically preserved. So that's one of the things that drove the method that we came up with and the work that we did. To fill that gap, it was myself, my colleague, Dr. Aislinn Thanish, under the direction of Professor William Gillies, who were doing this work, and we compiled a corpus of transcriptions from manuscripts that are relevant to the history of Scottish Gaelic. Now, transcription, as many of us well know, is not a neutral activity, particularly where abbreviations or problems of legibility are involved. And there's also a lot of metadata about the text that could be of use to the dictionary's lexicographers if they were to query something. So for that reason, what we did when we created this corpus was to mark everything up in TEI so as to supply that metadata and to remain accountable in terms of the editorial decisions. From using that approach where we remain accountable for all these editorial decisions, that has also resulted in a corpus that is very easy to manipulate and very queryable as well. In terms of what is Scottish Gaelic in pre-modern manuscripts versus what is Irish, that's an interesting discussion to be had because the vast majority of texts that we have in a Scottish context, they strive to adhere to the classical Gaelic standards. and therefore they can be difficult to distinguish linguistically from Irish manuscripts of the same period. How those manuscript sources relate to the vernacular is a little harder to say in a much longer discussion due to the lack of concomitant evidence on both sides of that for the entire period that we're dealing with. Our answer, our approach was to try to include as wide a range of materials as possible. So that's both texts and manuscripts produced in Scotland, and items from Ireland that can be shown to have been read and used in Scotland. So we see ourselves as having collected not so much pure specimens of a language, but evidence that collectively sketches out a complex sociolinguistic environment. And within these parameters, we are also trying to be highly inclusive in terms of subject matter, form, register, date, and so on and so forth. The resulting corpus that we have contains texts extant in 39 different manuscripts and represents the work of 73 different scribes. It comprises over 208 Gaelic words, supplying nearly 8,000 individual Gaelic headwords to the corpus. And the corpus ranges in date from the 12th to the 18th century, and it includes historical writing, heroic narrative, bardic poetry, medical and other scientific writings, legal documents, and more. It throws up occasional specimens of Middle Gaelic, a great deal of classical language, of course, and forms that distinctly resemble or anticipate Scottish Gaelic as well in that entirety. And I'm going to come back to this final statistic here in a little more detail as we go through the talk, but just to note at this point that of these nearly 8,000 headwords, 61% of these are also attested both in the Dictionary for Old Irish or Early Gaelic, Edel, and in the last authoritative Dictionary of Scottish Gaelic, which is that by Edward Dwelly. So on screen, you are hopefully seeing a sample of manuscript texts. These all happen to be legal materials. We have a fosterage contract on the far right. Going clockwise from that, at the bottom, we have the Argyll-O'Donnell Treaty. On the top left is a letter penned by Innes MacDowell of Islay. And then we have the Islay Charter as well. Sorry, the letter isn't legal material. I was looking at the other three items, but on we go. In terms of the digital editions of manuscript texts, I think the easiest thing to show you is to show you the end result of that. It is a web tool that was created by the developers at who work for Faclair Gaelic. They also work at DASC, that Digital Archive of Scottish Gaelic that I told you about earlier. They are Dr. Mark McConville and Stephen Barrett. So we'll just move on to the web tool demo. And if you don't mind giving me some thumbs up just to indicate that you can in fact see a different thing altogether with some Gaelic text on it for me, please. Perfect. Okay, as you see, I was practicing earlier to make sure everything would work, and my diplomatic text has not yet appeared. So what we have is in these XML files where all the information is stored, that brings up, you can extract that in different ways. And this web tool is built so that on the left here, we have the semi-diplomatic edition of the text, where we have imposed editorial norms. And on the right-hand side, taking from that very same document, taking all that information from the same document, we have the diplomatic edition. And this is if there are any issues with the reading that a lexicographer wanted to go back and see what was there. This is easy to pull up and go back and look at that information. However, on the left is going to be the more useful one, of course. Editorial interventions are imposed and it's readable much like a normal text. And what I'm going to do, in fact, here is I'll bring you up the first word to show you, and I will toggle the numbers off. So at any given point in the semi-diplomatic edition, we can put them back on and see what page and line number something appears on if we wanted to go back and have a look at that. But otherwise, it's easier to take those away. And as you see, when you select a word, all the encoded information behind it comes up here on the right hand side. So Croga in modern Irish, and this we can see is written by the scribe MacMeister Alistair. It is an adjective, it's a syntactically simple form. There is an edil, headword in edil for this, and there's also a headword in Dwelly as well. If we look at some more, we can see the very simple verb is coming up shortly. Nothing kind of complex here, but a form that these are more useful for is honig. So as you can see in the Dictionary of Early Gaelic Sources, that headword would be doig, and in the later dictionary, the headword would be hig. So if you're looking at this from a modern Gaelic or an early Gaelic point of view, you have the tools to see what this means and how it changes. And by encoding things like this, it means that we can find all forms of that verb doig or hig. If we look at either this text as a single unit, we could look at all the different forms, or across the entire corpus. So we've encoded a lot of different things in this manuscript as well. If, for example, I'm just going to go down a wee bit further here, you'll see that the other editorial intervention is that we have metrical lines imposed, so that is more easily readable. It wouldn't be the norm for semi-diplomatic texts, but our lexicographers are not automatically going to be people who read pre-modern texts, so this is important in order to make this much more accessible for them. Things that appear in manuscripts that you also need to deal with are perhaps deletions. If those happen, they appear with a double strike through in this edition to make it very clear. And in this case, we can see something else. So where we have syntactically complex forms, for example, compound words, these are noted and the information for each individual headword is given here as well. And when it is a deletion, if we're only looking at one specific word, the information panel on the right hand side will show us the entire deletion or addition or whatever, so we can get a better view of that from looking at this word. Additions are all noted in superscript in the manuscript, but here it tells us where exactly they appear. So they might appear above the line, below the line, in the margin, etc. Usually additions are uncontroversial, but in the cases where they may be controversial, this is us holding ourselves accountable again, that it's very clear what we did and why, and where that is to be found if somebody else was to go looking at this to see the original. On the headword side, you see a third headword down here titled HDSG, and that is that there was an attempt in the 70s to create a historical dictionary of Scottish Gaelic. That never came to fruition, but there was a large number of slips created. So where work was done on manuscripts that we have subsequently used, we've incorporated Ronnie Black's work from that preparatory work for an early dictionary. And that headword is noted here, and it can be clicked right through to a digitized version of the same. The other thing we would expect in a normal edition would be to have footnotes. So for example, footnotes are inserted where necessary. On this specific word, I'm noting that my interpretation of it is quite different to Black's, and also giving the reference to that earlier slip. So again, a lexicographer has the totality of information that they need in order to investigate this, consider it as a lexical item, and then make whatever decisions they need to make. One other thing we do, and this is one of the specific reasons I have used this text, is that we have a lot of names and texts, and they might not necessarily correspond to headwords that we have in dictionaries. So when we have names in texts, we mark them up as either toponyms, population names, which are terminoms, or place, population, and personal names. So here we can see that gloss, while it's also a word, it is being used as an anthroponym in this case. He is gloss Macdreven. So this is another syntactically simple form where we don't have a headword for Dreven, but we can see, the lexicographers can see immediately that they don't need a head word because it is a name in this case. And we also have place names marked up. So where we have place names, the entire information is contained in the right-hand panel. We have loch and lane, and in this case, where that's a real place and also has an entry in either in loganum.ie, which is the database of Irish place names, or Anamanaichin Halaba, which is the database of Scottish Gaelic place names. We link specifically to that. And again, that's another way that the varying treatments of a specific place name could be investigated, might be of use to the dictionary, but if not, and somebody else decided to come along and look at the treatment of place names, you can easily find them if they have these entries in the databases by a quick search. So yeah, I think that's it. Oh, and the last thing, my apologies, is that where we have editorial interventions in terms of we are changing the reading that we're seeing in the manuscript because we think there was an error for some reason. These appear in curly brackets here. Mourn, for example, it was a Mourn, and that appears 3 times, and it's simply the fact that grammatically that wouldn't happen. It's just maybe the scribe had a slip or had a break when writing something and wrote something that wasn't fully what we would expect grammatically. I'm just looking for a wee moment for an addition here that appears in square brackets where we have inserted something that is not apparent in it. We also note that in square brackets. So here, cohort, and that's much like any printed edition, you get additions are in square brackets, etc. So remaining accountable in all cases, and all this information is encoded behind the screen that you see. So with that in mind, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and talk you through a little bit of what goes on behind the scenes. So using marking these up according to TEI conventions. I'm sure most of you know TEI means Text Encoding Initiative. So that encodes all the information behind the scenes, allows it to be retrieved in the specific web tool, but it's all in the specific documents that we have created if somebody was looking at those individually, and happy to read them, I suppose, is the important point there. All the editing is done by us, so this wasn't put in and we didn't use any technology to do it. It was very much the work of scholars working on earlier Gaelic texts to understand manuscripts. So this is the markup that we have. If, for example, we're using the word truer as an example, this marks the beginning of an individual word and this marks the end of it. Only what you see on screen will appear. Only what you see in black will appear on screen, and these are the different elements. So this is the head word in the earlier Gaelic dictionary. This is a unique identifier so that if there are different versions of this word, for example, there are many different head words, that is spelled A, or do, so this distinguishes the different usages of them, and we have the part of speech as well here. That appears on screen. This is what I have been telling you, but it did not bring up immediately. Oh, in terms of marking up abbreviations as well, we note all abbreviations in the text. And we do that because sometimes with manuscript material, a very specific spelling will be suggested. For example, A or U or whatever, CU. In other cases, we will just get a suspension stroke, meaning insert the correct thing here. And those are the cases where it might be an editorial decision that somebody else might come along and disagree with. So again, we have marked up all instances. We've classified the different types of abbreviation that we find so that that can be brought up in the web tool to show this is very specifically suggesting that it's a superscript I. It's telling us that the abbreviation used is a superscript I, which then we as people who edit medieval Irish and Gaelic manuscripts know means insert an or before or afterwards. So it's showing the lexicographer that something very specific is being indicated by the manuscript. It's not that we have expanded as something. Oh, and then before I leave this, the certainty is high, and this is noted so that in cases where there is some doubt about what the abbreviation is, that is indicated very clearly because this information is transferred to the web tool as well. Next, I have a sample of this as if it was transcribed from our wee bit manuscript. The short phrase "vidal arana" to go to the forward. This is the simple markup that we would be looking at. We only have one abbreviation in this, the lenition stroke. This is a much longer sentence, but a lot more abbreviations. Aduit middag ismarig for niv. It's not the full phrase, but it fitted nicely on this slide. And you'll see here that once we have added a lot of abbreviations, there's a lot of markup, but it's done for every single word at a word level. And to make that differentiation between a diplomatic and semi-diplomatic edition, we note where there are scribal spaces as well. Again, to keep something as close as possible to the manuscript original. I haven't gone backwards. This is where we left off with a word that has an abbreviation in it. Again, these highlighted bits are all that goes on screen, even though what's behind the scenes is a lot more. And at this stage, where I mentioned before that we have the Historical Dictionary of Scottish Gaelic slips available to us as well, where those appear for a specific word. These are noted, so the head word on that slip and as well the specific reference to it, so the lexicographer can bring up a digital copy of that slip in the Faclair Gaelic system and have a read of it if they wanted to go back to that. And this notation just gets longer the more information you add. So for example, this is all the blue, orange and red is what goes on behind the scenes, and only the black, which is very little of this part of the slide, is what gets shown on screen. So all that information allows us to, it's put in behind the web tool, but it allows us to look at the corpus in different ways as well. I mentioned earlier that we had about 61% of head words that are in both Idil and Dwelly, so that's the dictionaries of early and later Gaelic. And this is an example from the database where we match those up. So instead of having to note every word that has both a Gaelic and, an early Gaelic and a modern Gaelic head word, what we've done is, where possible, use the earlier Gaelic form, and then if not, we'll use the modern Gaelic form as the head word and the reference, the unique reference to find all instances. But if there is a form in the Dictionary of Early Gaelic, we note what that is, and then we add a specific reference to the modern Gaelic dictionary so that the two are matched up, and we don't have to enter that information every single time that we enter the information for a Trier or Truer. It automatically is brought up by searching that separate database and drawing from both. So with all of the transcriptions marked up in such detail in XML, we can do a lot more than just producing these kinds of digital editions that I've just been demonstrating. For example, we can write queries and retrieve information from the transcriptions and from the markup that we have added. And that's what makes the web tool from our colleagues at Dask function. In fact, it's what underlies the head word search and that we use in the information panel, bringing up 2, if not 3 head words. And it also means that we can write our own customized queries for our transcriptions if we want to check them, if we want to look up something or analyze something and investigate that more closely. So to investigate the corpus in different ways, we use XPath, XQuery, and XSLT. So XQuery is, XPath gives us very quick searches for single data items. XQuery gives us tables for kind of multiple variables, and then XSLT gives us much more complex tables again with richer options of information and giving us results of a lot more data in one go. XPath, just in case you don't know, it's a bit like a file path, and that's used to navigate the tree structure of XML documents and return either a single piece of information or a single node or node set. And we would mainly use that within our development environment, Oxygen, to quickly find something we need to check or edit within those texts themselves. So some examples of the kind of texts we can perform: either return all the word count of a single head word within the entire corpus. We can return, for example, all compounds across the entire corpus or within a single text, depending on which we choose to do. We can look at a very specific word and give us all instances. There will be many, many instances of the copula, but there are some words where there's only 2 or 3 or 10 or 20 instances, and we can retrieve all instances across the entire corpus if we do a specific enough search, such as returning all instances of the copula. And then another one, for example, is anytime we want to find where a suspension stroke was used by a specific scribe, in this case, Cathal MacFidic, we could look at that as well, have the query tailored that much if needs be. And again, you can do this. It helps with editing and making editorial decisions on our end, that if you were looking for something that a scribe was doing, you'd be able to check against different practices in different ways, in different texts, or earlier on in the same text, without remembering exactly where that occurred and going searching for it. So when using Oxygen, we can input these sorts of searches and the results, and they return a node set, and they're linked to their location in an XML document, so they can be clicked through, checked, and edited if it needs be. And that's what it looks like in our editing interface. It's extremely useful when working directly with XML, but the results were very rarely intelligible outside of that. I suppose they are rarely intelligible outside that. XPath is also a bit limited in that you can specify lots of criteria, but ultimately it gives you one piece of information back, even if there are 20 individual pieces of information in the answer to that query. So given that there are limitations for everything that you do, of course, if we wanted to return much more complex results that are also human readable in an exported form, we can use XQuery or XSLT in terms of an XSLT style sheet. And again, just in case you're not familiar with these languages allow you to place multiple related XPath searches within a template and return more complex structured data as a result. So, for example, if I was looking at uses of the word Uther, and these are all tagged and easily retrieved using XPath, I might also want to provide references to where they are in the original manuscripts. So I would use XQuery to do that. And essentially, it means providing a framework of a document in HTML form, a table in this instance that we're going to get, and then inserting XPath expressions where the data is meant to go. And this would be the resulting table, which can then be opened as a spreadsheet, or if it were longer, for example, it could be searched accordingly, or the query could be further adapted to return subsets of results. So this here is a very, very tiny extract from our full corpus spreadsheet. That again is something that we could generate using an XSLT style sheet. As you can see from this tiny snippet, it does offer a significant amount of bibliographical, contextual, and morphological data for each specific form. And this XSLT, that's also what generates our supporting XML database that I mentioned earlier, and the headword from Scottish Gaelic is drawn into that, as I said, so we don't have to added in every single instance, and it speeds up the input of data on our side. Due to the fact that our corpus was rather large at the end, and due to the complexity of searching down certain pieces of data within our XML tree structure, long processing times did pose a significant logistical challenge in terms of our use of XSLT. So that was really only something that we did on an occasional basis. It was also, like, these long processing times, they caused issues when generating editions of the text early on. So that's why Mark and Stevie from Dask got involved, and they produced the professional web tool to speed up the processing times and base that more on XSLT. And then when that happened, given the difference between our prototype and the web tool that I showed you that was developed by professional developers, it was a bit surprising to us that the processing times were so slow initially, given that our underlying data is hardly vastly complex. It is complex to a certain degree, but it's following the manuscript, and in terms of like big data that's out there, it's not a massive corpus. So while it is well-formed XML, it's not, I suppose, an ergonomically rationally planned database. Rather, it follows the structure of what we found in the manuscript and which we adapted to fit exactly what we're seeing and working with throughout. One example of a difficulty that we encountered was in the Bookadier in the first instance, and occurred later on as well in other manuscripts. And that is where the scribal hand changes right in the middle of the word. So one scribe writes the first part and another scribe writes the second part. And even though that's very simple to describe on a human level, speaking or noticing it, it did result in many hours of programming and lines of code in order to handle that specific instance within the corpus, to be able to encode it into what we were doing. So in that case, we weren't incidentally trying to return data for that specific word, but detecting the change of hand within a word is kind of, that was important for classifying the rest of the word in that text, contributions by a specific scribe, etc., etc. So there are many reasons that that could be important later on, and we wanted to be as comprehensive as possible when that's what was happening elsewhere. We also needed to find a way to deal with this happening mid-word. So it turns out that producing markup that encodes multiple aspects of a primary source, linguistic, codicological and paleographical data, for example, that's surprisingly demanding in terms of computer processing. And as far as we could tell, our mistake early on in using between the prototype and the web tool was to rely far too much on XSLT. That's a very precise instrument, not intended for large-scale data transformation. So the key seems to be to use the faster, blunter instruments and then only call on XSLT where that is really needed. So all in all, it means that there are many possibilities for querying our corpus as it currently is. There are also, I'm sure, many further possibilities than we have been able to use or perform on this corpus, but our limitations had to be curbed, our ambitions have to be curbed by the specific aims and objectives of the project and what was necessary for the good of the Faclair, and specifically what needed to be there for the lexicographers to work on this data. So given that we can query the corpus in different ways, I thought I would give you some insights into this data as well. And I'll do that in terms of some fun facts, I suppose you could call them. We can tell the different contributions that different scribes make to the manuscripts corpus, whether that is throughout the whole thing, so not just based on an individual text or an individual manuscript. So our longest individual tale is that one which I showed you on the manuscript web tool. It is Coffee and Thraw by Alistair MacFeister Alistair. The scribe who appears most frequently in transcriptions is Ewan MacFall. He contributes to 5 different texts in our manuscript. But if we look at it across the entire corpus of over 200,000 words, Neil MacFurlick actually writes more than MacFeister Alistair, contributing over 28,000 words across 4 different transcriptions, including the well-known Red Book of Clanranald. MacFeister Alistair is up there though, because Coffee and Thraw is just such a long tail. There's also, we can count how much every single scribe contributes. So the shortest contribution is that of 2 words. It is Donald MacDonald, or Dole MacDole. He is Lord of the Isles, and so he simply signs himself MacDole, MacDonald, and you know who that is. There are a number of scribes who only make very short contributions. They're listed here. That went a wee bit too fast. We can also see the most collaborative transcriptions. For example, some of our medical manuscripts have a lot of different contributors. They don't have names. They're simply National Library of Scotland Advocates Manuscript 72-127, 72-123, and 72-14. That's another medical manuscript, and the Beatons are involved in all of those, a famous medical family from Islay. And then the Book of Deer is, of course, not a medical manuscript. That is one of our earliest Gaelic texts that we can place as having been specifically written in Scotland. And that has 6 different contributors, 6 hands, but all of whom are unfortunately unnamed. I've mentioned the abbreviations and how these can be important in terms of suggesting specific readings, or telling the lexicographers that it is us making a decision that this is how it should be expanded, but how certain we are that is it a problematic reading or something we are very confident of. However, given that we were classifying that for the lexicographers, we can actually count the abbreviations as well and tell something about the way in which medieval Irish and Gaelic scribes wrote. So in this case, we're able to kind of classify them all. We have 105 different types of abbreviations classified in this corpus. The number 1, which will be of no surprise to anybody who reads any Gaelic manuscripts at all, is that lenition markers count for 1/3 of all abbreviations. That's something that we would have logically thought before, but we wouldn't have had exact numbers. So counting for 1/3 is a huge number of abbreviations. And I've given you a top 5 here. So the generic suspension stroke is the next. The end stroke occurs in 3rd place. The Tironian nota, which is like a number 7 on the lower part of the line, expanded as August or Et, is also very popular. And number 5 on our list is our AR abbreviation. However, if you ever meet a suspension stroke, it's simply a straight line, and you have to decide, is this an end stroke or is it in fact a generic suspension stroke? And it seems that that question is always going to be one there, because it's around about 50-50 divide in our corpus as to which one it's going to be. There's only 13 occurrences of a difference between 2nd and 3rd place here. So again, we can't say it's more likely to be an end stroke than a suspension stroke. They're actually about 50-50. Again, this is just something that's interesting in terms of quantifiable data about the process of writing in these medieval Gaelic manuscripts. Not all scribes abbreviate to the same amount, and I just thought I would look quickly at how often scribes abbreviate. Across the entire corpus, it's just about 70 per 100 words. But something that is very logical is that the shorter the text, the less abbreviations there tend to be. So if we have scribes who write between 100 and 1,000 words, that's just under 50 abbreviations per word per 100 words. If they write between 1,000 and 10,000, it is just over 66 abbreviations per 100 words. And if they write quite long text, quite long contributions in total, where they have over 10,000 words in the corpus, it tends to be up at about 73 abbreviations per 100 words. And again, All scribes are not equal in terms of their practices. Some abbreviate much more frequently than others. For example, Cathal MacBurdick is the most frequent abbreviator, even though he doesn't have the longest contribution to the corpus. He only writes about 5,000 words, but he's writing about 88 abbreviations per 100 words. MacFeister Alistair wrote quite a long text, and he's up quite close to that. But then other scribes who have long transcriptions, but not a huge amount, are up there as well, such as Christopher Beaton, who penned much of the material in the Black Book of Clanranald. And then there's an anonymous hand who writes 80 abbreviations in his total of 100-word contribution to the corpus. So that's a very neat statistic. We have discounted some of the results in this, for example, where the contributions are too short. One hand writes 20 words, and there are 21 abbreviations therein. Donald MacDonald, who I mentioned earlier, writes 2 words with 2 abbreviations, etc. So we didn't count those in the general average, just because they're far too short to feed into it. Next, one more prolific abbreviator noted there, Gàidhlig Cullen as well. One of the final statistics I'm going to give you in this is in terms of head word frequency. So with a corpus this large, you're going to get some words which are repeated again and again and again, and some words which only occur a few times in that. So if we group the head words by frequency as a proportion of all the head words, words which are attested once, form the largest number of the entire head words. So of the nearly 8,000 head words that we have, about 37% of them only occur once. However, if we group them by frequency and then look at how much space they take up in the corpus, because the more frequent ones occur in more places, then the words that are attested over 1,000 times, they take up 41% of the corpus. Now, this makes a lot of sense in terms of linguistic data. It's approaching Zipf's law, which for those of you, I presume you all know, but just in case, a quick summary is that the most frequent word will appear twice as many times as the next frequent word, etc., down the line. And of course, the most frequent word that we have in our corpus is, unsurprisingly to any of you with Irish or Gaelic and who knows any manuscripts, is Agus. Aguses are all over the place, and it is the #1 word in our corpus, so it appears quite a lot. So even though those words which only occur once might be more valuable because it's an unusual attestation, they don't take up a huge amount of space in the corpus overall if we're looking at it in terms of this graph on the bottom left. And then the final thing that I wanted to talk to you about today is, while I go back, and this is very twitchy today, is corpus visualizations. And this is because a way in which we can query the corpus that is, I suppose, inexpensive in terms of processing time, is to use network graphs. These create graphs so that we can visualize different amounts of information. So our software package of choice for this was Gephi. That is free and open source. It's popular in history and social sciences for generating graphs of social networks. And the graphs that you have, once you've put in your data and gotten a visualization, they consist of nodes and edges. Nodes are entities and edges are relationships between those entities. So I'll explain those in a wee minute if you're not familiar with the terms. But in order to get these results, all we need to do is use xquery to produce a CSV list of edges. That's nodes that connect to each other, and a list of nodes which provides further attributes to those. So nodes that I'm talking about, a node is an entity. For example, it could be a scribe, a text, an individual word. and the edge is the relationship between those two things. So, for example, the authorship of a text by a scribe, or a word used in a given text by a given scribe. And nodes and edges can also have attributes, for example, weight, if it's used more frequently somewhere else in one place than another, we can make that influence the graph to show us different things. So this is our entire corpus with colored nodes showing texts, and the black nodes are content-bearing vocabulary items. Non-content bearing vocabulary items are not there, just to make this much easier to manage. So the colors relate to the social provenance of the text's main scribe, and we have a key on the left. MacWeister Alistair stands out on his own. We have the Beatons and affiliates, some medical scribes for a large part, who tend to have blue nodes. We have Book of Deer scribes in green, etc., etc. And when we are examining the corpus in this way, something that we didn't see early on, but that did become apparent towards the end of the project as the corpus grew and neared its current size, was that the graph was rather homogeneous, with many of the text pulled into the center as the ratio of common vocabulary nodes to uniquely attested vocabulary nodes increased. So something we do see in this, however, that is quite useful, is that texts are clustering in terms of genre. So towards the upper right, grouped around the large red node, that is Alistair MacWeister Alistair's Coffee and Thraw, we typically find fin cycle prose narratives, as well as historical tales like the books of Clanranald. To the west of that, more towards the center of the graph, we find religious narratives, such as the account of the Passion from the 1467 manuscript. And interestingly, these have clustered together with the secular story collection, the Seven Sages of Rome, one of the latest additions to the corpus. Somewhat to the left, well, the somewhat segregated area to the left of that in blue, that is populated by a number of texts on medicine and ancillary subjects such as astrology and philosophy. Once you come around clockwise from that, the variegated area along the bottom of the graph comprises all manner of texts whose common feature really is that they are relatively short and struggle to distinguish themselves on this graph. And then to the east of that, the purple and amber area below Coffee and Thraw, that's inhabited by the corpus's collection of bardic poetry. So this is done on a large scale, but to show you how this is useful for looking at shared vocabulary, we'll look at much shorter and much smaller corpus. So if we only looked at the vocabulary items used in the legal texts, down here on the right in green, we have the Book of Deer. On the left, we have the MacLeod-Fostridge contract. On the right, the MacDougall contract. And up here, we have the Isla Charter. We see that there isn't a huge amount of shared vocabulary. And one of the reasons for this is that there is not a standardized form of legal language being used at this time. But also, these are texts that deal with very different legal matters. So the Isla Charter is a land grant. The property records, which are coming in the 12th, which are written in the 12th century, they're written at a time when kind of administration is becoming much more important in the land of Scotland, and therefore they're recording grants to the manuscript, but they may not be based on any specific formula, maybe something they formulated on their own. Even though they do show signs of influence from Latin charters. On the left, Fostridge, dealing with fostering a child in different incidents, who is responsible if different incidents occur. And on the right, the MacDougall contract, that's again a different contract of land, and who's responsible for the land and the payment and the work due for that. Another example is this one here, where we have broken a much longer text up into paragraphs. And we had done that while looking at these graphs in order to make the resulting kind of editions more accessible in the first place, but also in terms of this, we can drill down into the individual texts more deeply to analyze how the different components relate to each other. So that can tell us something different than maybe what the corpus spreadsheets or querying can do. So the Gephi graph that you are seeing on screen here, it shows the prose paragraphs from the books, Red Book of Clanranald, and the embedded poetry from that same book. So the Red Book, as you may or may not know, is innovative as a work of Gaelic historical prose writing, in that it embedded classical bardic panegyrics and elegies within a more realist prose narrative. And the two registers at work here are brought into sharp relief by this visual analysis, which shows that there is a large amount of vocabulary that is distinctive to the poems in the manuscript, and a large amount of different vocabulary which is distinctive to prose. We can compare this across different texts, and I have an example from you here. The Red Book of Clanranald, which we just saw, is on the right, and on the left-hand side we have that tale I've been mentioning a few times now, Coffee and Straw. One of my favourites, but also given its length and the linguistic complexity, it is particularly interesting for these types of studies. So that's another lengthy text that contains both prose and poetry. But here we find that the poetry struggles to distinguish itself on the graph, whereas there is a huge amount of verbal virtuosity in the evidence in the prose. That could be partly because the poems in Coffee and Straw tend to be shorter, and short texts tend to get subsumed within these graphs. That's a real methodological problem, excuse me. But it could also, in this case, be to do with the role that poetry plays in Coffee and Straw, because the role it plays in this text, which is different from the Red Books of Clanranald, is to reiterate and summarize the action that we have just heard about in the prose. So many of the poems in the Red Book, in contrast, are compositions in their own right, with their own distinctive arguments and perspective, and relating a specific incident in greater detail than what we would find in the prose. So hopefully these graphs, along with everything else I have been telling you, have given you some idea of the character of the corpus that we created for Faclair na Gaeilge, and the kind of insights that can be gained or potentially be gained from different types of analysis into this data and different things that can be done with it. So, Sinead Wimsa, Kiatang, or son Eishtach, no for the Irish speakers in the audience. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Martina. Wonderful talk. Very interesting. So I'll start by opening the floor up to questions. If there's any questions anyone wants to ask. If not, I'll start. So, I mean, obviously, one of the things we're doing in Cardamom is looking at the use of kind of automatic techniques. So how we can, existing NLP tools right up to sort of, state-of-the-art kind of large language models style approaches. So I was wondering, what scope do you see for automating this? And in particular, in the context of dictionaries, there's also the Alexis project as well, which you might be aware of. And if you've looked at any of the tools of that, or if anything, automation was useful in the creation of this dictionary?
So, as I said, automation was used for the Digital Archive of Scottish Gaelic, which is just regular printed material. I think in terms of, we don't have character recognition for this data, or for the Gaelic hand that we would get in manuscripts, and that would certainly be one of the kind of barriers to it. Once you have a transcribed text, while we've been doing this by hand, so to speak, to make sure it's all kind of correct and present, and when one of us worked on a manuscript, the other person then came along and worked it afterwards. So you have the perspective of two different scholars with who have the earlier forms of the language in order to make sure we have it as correct as possible. But I know that for the Folklore na Gaeilge that Charlie Dillon is in charge of, they were looking at automatically tagging headwords. And one of the things that they did, because they're obviously in that kind of in-between period where Edel ends and before you get dictionaries like O'Donnell, so the rules for the older spelling, which is obviously much more reflective of what we get in Edel, so perhaps with lenition added, given the conventions of leniting or not, they imposed the rules that the Christian Brothers grammar had to kind of automate the process of tagging headwords, and that was quite successful, I believe. They did need to kind of go back and examine it to make sure they were right, but on a large scale, a lot of it was done. So it kind of sped up the process for them in terms of tagging large amounts of texts. And it's something that if you had a corpus like this, if that was fed into it and the same headwords are used, it could be quite useful to add to something like that. If somebody was looking at the two different ones to, I suppose, try to make it more accurate in terms of recognizing what it is. The other barrier that I would see that I don't really know how, and again, language processing might well be able to overcome it, but when you have a suspension stroke, to know what is the correct form to put in there, in terms of what makes sense to a human reader rather than what is the most likely thing we get for suspension strokes. But as I said, you guys will know more about that than I, to have a better view on how that might be overcome.
Okay, thanks a lot. Are there some other questions? Adrian?
Well, ar dús bála mar gurb míle maithagat as seminar on a himúil agus tábhachtach cuma. So I suppose firstly, as regards the headwords, you mentioned that you take the oldest Scottish Gaelic form, if I'm not mistaken, and use that as a headword.
No, so because Edel has the headwords where they can be identified in distinguishable form. So for example, you can distinguish a possessive from the vocative from the preposition, etc. So we used the link unique reference via the Edel Earl. That's what we used as the, so we used that, and then where the same word is present in the Gaelic dictionary written by Dwelly, we had the database. We would manually input the database to say, so for example, trier in Old Irish is truer in Modern Gaelic. That's fine. Or I don't know, anim is still anim, for example, but the ik is becomes hig. That's modern form, like the name of the verb. So we used Edel because some of the texts will use older forms as well, and our lexicographers will sometimes need to look at the evidence from that usage to find how it's being used in these texts. It won't always align, as far as we can see, with what is in the Modern Gaelic dictionary. So they need the earlier evidence and the later in order to analyze that more completely. So that's how we did the. There's obviously a lot that's kind of sitting in between, like, you know, the stuff that we find in Edel and the stuff that we find in Dwelly, but we're confident when we have noted a head word that this is what the word is. Sometimes maybe not a form that's attested or easy to find elsewhere, but at least now that can be brought into the data that they're using.
Oh yeah, that's exactly where I was going with it. Is what if there was no attested I suppose lemma form of it. But the other thing then was, I noticed in one of your examples, specifically the one where you had supplied text in square brackets, that showed up then in what looked like the head word, if I'm not mistaken. Do you have instances where head words by necessity have been reconstructed, or are they all quite, you know, simple?
No, we haven't. We have a few instances of the corpus where we're like, this is a word that we don't think is attested, we think it is the head word. And we had a way of noting those, so we just put a star and the head word that we thought it was, and then used a reference from either Dwelly or Edel to show kind of what we based that upon. So one of the things that we wouldn't use that for is that Edel doesn't always have a separate entry for the verbal noun form, which is, it's not completely consistent across the entirety of Edel. Not useful for us because we want to distinguish the verbal form from the verbal noun. So sometimes we just have to use the Dwelly head word for that, just to kind of go, it's distinguishable and we can find all instances of the verbal noun without the verb itself. In terms of reconstructing head words, we tended to use what we considered Old Irish spelling, because they were usually kind of more obscure forms. There isn't a huge number of them, but at the same time, it was a conversation between myself and Dr. Rayson Thanish in order to kind of say, right, based on what we know of Old Irish, this is how we think that head word should be spelled. Because it's not something that cropped up a huge amount, we don't have a very kind of detailed methodology for it. And it is something that perhaps if somebody else came along and wanted to look at those things that we think should be dictionary entries that are not, perhaps with more investigation and more sources, they might spell them differently. But again, given that it's a very, very small percentage of the overall head words, we didn't think, given the larger aims, that we should be spending a huge amount of time debating what exactly the spelling was. So if there was a similar form in Edel, we would go with the older Irish spelling, so no shevu or whatever, and then spell it similar to however it was that we had worked it out. So if it was a form, so if, I don't know, if it was an adjective that there was an attested noun for, the first part might be the same, and then the ending like ACH or something. I presume ACH now adjectives are largely attested, but I can't think of an example right now of one that we did note as such.
Okay, yeah, well, thanks very much. It's one of those interesting areas that you're right when you say, you know, we shouldn't spend a huge amount of time debating it, but then it's a very interesting question as to how you do it when you come up against an unattested form, or a form where you go, if we use this spelling, will people actually be able to find it by the head word?
Yeah, I think we followed Edel quite a lot in order to make that kind of more accessible, because if the lexicographers and anybody else coming to this is used to using Edel, we don't want to deviate massively from that.
Okay, great, thanks a lot. Are there some other questions? Peter?
Hi, thanks, Martina. That was brilliant as usual. I'm always fascinated to see these diagrams. Two questions, if I can remember what they were. The first one is whether or not the material is marked up according to script. You might have said that, I can't remember. And then the second one, which is sort of related, is what's the latest material in this sort of sub-project of Faclair na Gaelic that you were incorporating, thinking that there are a number of your scribes who use two different scripts at well, more than a number, quite a lot of them. But thinking of MacLeister Alistair, who produces material in large volume in both script.
Yeah, so almost all of our material is just in the Correlature or Clo Gaelach. There's very little that is not in that. So we didn't mark up script just for the very reason that it is a piece of information, given what's in the corpus, would be too much processing time and too much of our time in order to have done that. So in terms of MacLeister Alistair specifically, he is the answer to your second question of the latest material. But in Coffee and Twa, I think he only writes 2 words that are in English with the change of script, and there's just a footnote saying he changes script here, in order to kind of note that. As well as that, then because his version of Coffee and Straw is so it's the early modern text kind of overlaid with Scottish Gaelic forms, but it is, and there's an interesting mix of the two there coming together. So he is the latest text in the corpus overall because he is mixing the two in very interesting ways, and we felt it would be an omission. There's also usages attested in that to my knowledge are not attested elsewhere. The lexicographers will obviously know best. They'll have a lot of data to work from, but some of the stuff that I searched in Dask, not wanting to spend a huge amount of time to find it, I couldn't find that specific usage elsewhere the way he had used it in Coffee and Straw. So we felt that given his breadth of knowledge and ability in Gaelic, and B, the mix of the two, it was very important to have that included in the corpus, that it would be a gaping omission if it wasn't there.
Great, thanks very much.
Okay, great. Any further questions?
If there's nobody else, I have a load of questions. I'm always like this. So you were talking at the beginning about your use of TEI, and it strikes me that your project is one of, I won't say very few, but one of it's one of the rare ones that really jumps in at the deep end with TEI in terms of Gaelic resources, because of course we have resources like the Corpus of Electronic Texts and Thesaurus Linguae Hibernicae that they use TEI tags to some extent, and they are, and it's very useful that they do, but it's almost a way of marking up the web page rather than really identifying little minutia in a sense. I know TLH does identify abbreviations and chevus or and such, but at the same time they don't tell you exactly what they are in the manuscript. So it strikes me that a huge amount of work must have been done by you. Did you have to go back to every manuscript and identify each individual type of abbreviation and mark that you used? Or is there a sense in which you can say, well, based on what the edition we're using has expanded it to, it's probably this?
No, we transcribed all of the material directly from the manuscripts themselves. The only time that wasn't the case was the Isla Charter was too deteriorated, so it had to be partially. We partially had to use the printed editions. For those, however, we did we've specifically noted this is an editorial space. It's an editorial form that we're using because we can't read it. With marking up the abbreviations, one of the reasons that they're numbered the way they are is that it's just led by the development of the work. So, for example, the first abbreviation that Easton encountered, because he was working on the project me, was obviously an M stroke, because that's the first, that's G1 in our corpus. G2 was the Turonian noter, 3 was the generic suspension stroke, 4 was the punctuated. So in terms of being led by it, it was kind of always going to be part of how the texts were marked up, and that we just created a database of so G1's always an M stroke, so that when that was noted, the database would, when the web tool was finally made, draw in that G1 means it's an M stroke. Here's the description of it, and in the web tool we linked as well in that description in a separate file to any instances where the abbreviation is noted in Chinskull and Nud. They're not all there. So for example, the 105, as you get to 105, that's an abbreviation that's only used once, twice, 5, 10 times in the corpus, very little. So it's something we came across quite late, and I think that was there from the very beginning. And all the super frequent ones, they appear very early on in the list, so they're always going to be part, and the numbering system is basically the order in which they were encountered in the work that we did.
Okay, great. Thanks. So are there any further questions?
Maybe I
Ross?
may ask a question, yeah.
Go ahead.
Martina, Margaret. You showed a slide which had the title XSLT with the council word, was a curle or whatever it's pronounced in Scottish Gaelic. You had the stem class and perhaps some other morphosyntactic features there. Did you manually extract them from DIL or automatically, or are they from another resource entirely?
No, that's actually when we were doing the headword data. So at certain intervals, we would just mine the entire corpus for any new headwords that we entered. And then we would create the database of matching them up. When we were doing that, we actually also entered the STEM and gender information, thinking that if this is used for something else or any different analysis, that's something that's quite useful to already be incorporated. We did take them from EDEL in terms of we wrote down what was there, but we just did that manually in terms of mining the corpus at intervals to say these are the new headwords, and if you're going to match it up with the modern Gaelic headword anyways, you might as well add that data. Just thinking of other people might come along and use this in different ways to us or analyze it in different ways. So we wanted it to be a bit more complete than just Old Irish headword and modern early Gaelic headword, I should say, and then modern Gaelic headword.
All right, yeah, that's might be handy. I might have some use cases in a few years, but not at the moment. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, I do. So I find you, as you mentioned in your slides, if you start using too much XSLT, you often end up in quite a difficult situation. It can be quite unwieldy. Yeah. Okay, great. So unless anyone has any last thing, I'd just like to thank Martina again. It was an excellent talk. The next Cardamom Seminar will be at the end of next month. It'll be Bernardo talking about the workbench we've been developing. So I hope you can all make it, and I'll see you in a month. So thank you, Martina, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks a million.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Martina. Mark.